U.S. negotiators are in Geneva for key talks on the war in Ukraine and Iran's nuclear program. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and President Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner just met with Iran's foreign minister and are also taking part in trilateral talks with Russian and Ukrainian officials. Our chief foreign correspondent Ian Pannell has more on both of those stories. Hi, Ian. Busy day for you. So Iran's foreign minister says the path for a deal has started. What's the latest on that, and where do these talks go from here?
Yeah, I mean, these are pretty critical talks. As you say, a very busy day for diplomacy, certainly in Geneva, Switzerland, being in the spotlight. So first of all, we had these talks involving the Iranian delegation led by the Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi, the US delegation, again led by Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, the US Special Envoy. We don't know the details, is a short answer to that. What we do know is that the US and President Trump have made it clear that Iran should have no nuclear capability. Now, not necessarily nuclear weapons. Iran has consistently denied it's trying to develop nuclear weapons, but it does have a high amount of highly enriched uranium, which potentially could be used. President Trump, certainly in the public statements that we've heard from the administration, has indicated that there should be none of this material, there should be no nuclear program, but also suggesting that they want a deal basically to curb Iran's ballistic missile program, as well as its support for the so-called proxies. These are armed militant groups throughout the region that Iran backs, like the Houthi rebels in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iran, meanwhile, has pretty much made it clear that it only wants to talk about the nuclear issue, not getting rid of it necessarily, but potentially reducing it in exchange for some kind of sanctions relief. But I think we're getting two different messages. Araghchi's message that he posted seems to suggest that there has been progress made. Meanwhile, we've had another statement from Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, going on to X, saying the US is a corrupt and oppressive empire interfering in Iran's internal affairs, appearing to reject any kind of restrictions on its missiles. So we just have to wait and see whether they've been able to bridge the gap. But meanwhile, you've got this ramping up of military pressure. President Trump, again, referring to it yesterday, saying they need to make a deal with a clear implicit, if not explicit, threat that if they don't, there could be military action.
Meanwhile, President Trump is putting the onus on Ukraine to come to the table fast. He says the U.S. and Russia are in a position to make a deal. So what are you watching for in these trilateral talks?
Yes, and it's not quite clear what President Trump means by Ukraine coming to the table fast. I mean, Ukraine has been at the table pretty much since the get-go. The reality is that I think President Trump wants Ukraine to give up some of its land. Now, it already partially accepts that it has lost a significant amount of territory. The facts are on the ground in the sense that Russia occupies around 20% of Ukrainian territory. But Russia keeps referring to the Anchorage deal. Remember when Vladimir Putin flew to Anchorage, to Alaska, to meet with President Trump, and they talked a lot about what a final deal could look like. Russia wants the entirety of the Donbass. Now, it's managed to take most of it militarily, but there's a significant and very important part of it that it hasn't been able to, and they're asking Ukraine just to give it up. And Ukraine is saying, well, we're not going to. It's a deal that Zelensky would never be able to sell anyway. So you still have these two key differences. And while Russia is certainly giving the impression that it's serious about talks, it's serious about negotiations, it continues to launch these attacks. Overnight again, we saw hundreds of attack drones. We saw dozens of ballistic missiles fired into Ukraine, particularly in the southern port city of Odessa. You now have a situation where over 500,000 people have basically gone throughout what has been one of the most brutal winters on recent record inside Ukraine without any heating, with limited power. Some people not having access to water. I mean, these temperatures have plummeted to as low as -13 Fahrenheit, and yet are having to try and survive the winter without it. So there's a collective punishment in Russia's military tactics. Its military campaign goes on while proclaiming that it's ready to make a deal. But the only way it seems to want to make a deal is if Ukraine capitulates and gives up territory that it simply cannot. Otherwise, what is the battle? What has the war been for? Next year is 4 years since the start of the large-scale invasion. And realistically, I don't think anyone in Ukraine would tell you that they think it's about to end. Diane?
Ian Pannell, thank you. And let's bring in ABC News national security and defense analyst Mick Mulroy for more. Hi, Mick. So the delegations called the last round of talks on Ukraine constructive, but they didn't make any breakthroughs on those big points Ian just mentioned, potential territory concessions or security guarantees. So how critical are those sticking points, and how do you see those negotiations playing out?
So, Diane, they're very critical and they're tied together, right? So the part of the Donbass that Ian was referring to is called the fortress belt, because the Ukrainians believe if they lose it, they could potentially even lose Kyiv. So if that were to be part of this negotiation where the Ukrainians would give that up, they would need ironclad Article 5 type NATO security guarantees that they would be protected if Russia then decides to continue the conflict, which they certainly could. And if they had that certain section of Donbass, it would be much easier for them. So I think they would not only require these diplomatic security guarantees, but actually forces be deployed to Ukraine to ensure that Russia does not just restart the war when it's more advantageous to them. It's still unclear whether Ukrainians are willing to do this, but if they don't have those guarantees, I think it's almost impossible for them to do that.
And Mick, President Trump wants Iran to end all nuclear enrichment and rein in its ballistic missile program and regional proxies. But he also says regime change in Iran is the best thing that could happen. What's the strategy there?
So it appears that the strategy is a maximal pressure one, in the sense that the United States is at least publicly saying that any agreement has to include all of those factors. So not only nuclear weapons, but also proxy forces and ballistic missiles, and even the potential for a regime change, likely in the event that these negotiations collapse. It's unclear what the negotiators are actually saying, as the key to any negotiation is compromise. So will the United States be willing to accept a far less strong agreement at the end to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, which seems to be the primary policy objective here? The questions will be answered, of course, if these continue and we can start seeing the framework and shape of where this is going. If they fall apart, then of course the United States is postured for significant military action against Iran.
And Iran's responding to the U.S. military buildup with military exercises of its own. How could that affect these talks?
So that's right, Dan. They're focusing on their exercises around the Straits of Hormuz, which is significant in that if that was sea mined, it could obstruct the flow of energy from that region. 20% of the world's energy supply comes through those very narrow straits, and only the U.S. could clear that, and it could take weeks, if not months. And then, of course, it depends on whether commercial vessels would even then be willing to go through there. So they have the capacity to significantly disrupt the flow of global energy, and I think that's where they're focusing their exercises. One, because they want to be prepared to do that, but two, they're trying to send a message to the United States and the rest of the world that this could be the result of any direct U.S. military action against the regime.
Mick Mulroy, thank you.